Okay, so by way of introduction, I want to put up there up front that I'm going to approach the Aristotle, but also everything else we read, and we're going to read Hegel later in the, probably this is our second meeting, probably by our fifth meeting, we will read a short selection from the Minor Logic, where Hegel talks about the syllogism, sort of his reworking of Aristotle's dialectical logic. And I've always found it very challenging. Hegel is very challenging and sort of incredibly dense and exciting, but it kind of has to be, because that's the nature of what he's studying, these fundamental questions. And so we will definitely sort of have cross-pollination between the phenomenology and also Hegel's notion of the syllogism. And then if we will read this short article by a great American philosopher, political economist, David L. Harvey, who, as I said last time, is the lesser of the famous Harveys, but in my view, has written something that David Harvey himself hasn't written, maybe because he focuses on capital in a different way, but a short article, relatively short article by David L. Harvey, where he reads Hegel's use of logic, dialectical logic, and he shows how Marx literally draws on Hegel's syllogism, his framework, methodological framework, for his groundbreaking study of capital flows in volume 2 of Capital. So David L. Harvey reads Marx's second volume of Capital through dialectical logic, the way Marx himself was thinking it as he wrote it. Right? He kind of excavates this because Marx unfortunately didn't leave us with a statement on what was his method of thinking, and how did he think explicitly. He basically kind of assumed that everybody was already familiar with 2,000 years of Western philosophy, and Hegel's dialectic was already internalized by people who want to study, anything. So, and then hopefully we'll reach that point, the David L. Harvey. If we run out of time and we don't reach David L. Harvey, I propose to meet one extra time for free, of course, because it's my fault, and have like a ninth meeting if people want. So we can actually talk about David and read David L. Harvey's article, at least part of it, or be exposed to it, because I think he died fairly recently, and he's kind of an underappreciated thinker who's, I think, very powerful and very important, and very kind of modest. I don't think he wrote books, or he wrote articles, but very brilliant and careful. Okay, so by way of finishing the introduction, I just want to say that my approach to Aristotle's categories, for example, would be from a position of an excited, sort of innocent person who is experiencing wonderment as I'm encountering these ideas. And this is true. Like, I'm forcing myself to read the first 10 books of the categories. I've read some of them before carefully, but not all of them. So for me, this is also a process of discovery. But I want to read it with a clean ear and sort of clean eyes as much as possible, because I don't want to fall into some of the cliches or some of the sort of automatic interpretations that have accumulated over time. And the same thing for Hegel. Like, we're not going to say that Hegel was simply like an idealist philosopher who got very close to materialism. Okay, but that's not very helpful for me. Like, I want to read Hegel as a sort of on his own terms as much as possible, sentence by sentence, and then see what we get out of it. Similarly, I don't want to read Marx as somebody who inverted Hegel and sort of upside down, and he was sort of a materialist where Hegel remained, a captive of his overemphasis upon thought, as sort of like ground zero of what does it mean to be human. I think these are dogmatic readings that are oversimplifying both the connection between these two people, but also the actual content of the work, which is much more complicated and contradictory. And I think we will also read simultaneously with Hegel a chapter or two from a thinker who is only now being translated into English. He was translated before, but only now he's being translated heavily. Is probably the best representative of sort of like mid-20th century to the 1970s thinker on dialectical logic. It was a Soviet philosopher by the name of Ilyenkov, who left a body of work that is now being sort of translated to English very actively by American scholars. But this person played a pivotal role in fighting back against dogmatic interpretations, simplistic interpretations of Marx and Hegel and Aristotle and Spinoza and sort of these fundamental thinkers. And I think he has a nice overview essay to Hegel's logic, which I think we should perhaps read first or together with Hegel's original text, because I think it would amplify what we get out of it. So this is sort of like the reading list for this semester. So just to start now with Aristotle, there's a quote by Hegel that I find very beautiful and very accurate. So Hegel said that the whole point of, I'm paraphrasing incorrect, like loosely. Hegel says at one point that the essence sort of being a human being that's fully formed and fully functional, whether you use Kant's notion of human being that's mature, somebody that's capable of using their intelligence, which is what all humans can in various degrees, but they're actually got to the point where they can actually draw on whatever tools they inherently have as they arrive in this world. So Hegel said that for him, one of the litmus tests on whether someone is functioning optimally, if you will, as human being, or a goal that you would want to aspire to, is the ability to persist through the tension of the contradiction that you're involved in life. Whether the contradiction might be encountered in your family life or work, or it's irrespective of the circumstances. But there has to be a cultivated ability. This is something that is cultivated. This is not something that we can all do just simply by being born human, right? But it's the cultivated ability to persist through the tensions of the contradiction. For Hegel, this was the goal, sort of the final arrival point of the whole goal of learning how to think and how to do and how to be a person to your full potential, whatever that may be, right? So I think this is an interesting thing to keep in mind for Hegel's own study of contradictions, but it also is a good point to start with the Aristotle, because Aristotle's categories, which, as you know, are part of a relatively early body of work of Aristotle's, which is now codified under the term the Organon, which includes several works of which we're only reading small parts. We're reading more or less the first 10 books of the categories and the first few sections of the prior analytics. And part of the reason why this, I think, is very difficult to read, for me at least, is because these are very terse, kind of semi-formed, in some cases, short sections of lecture notes that have reached us. These are lecture notes. But they're so extraordinary, the force of the thinking is so extraordinary that we're reading somebody's lecture notes taken by a student that has served as the foundation for 2,300 years of politics and philosophy and thinking. You can imagine what the full version would have been of let's say, Aristotle's logic. Now we have a hint of the full force of Aristotle's thought if we read one of his last works, which is the Metaphysics. We're not going to read the Metaphysics because, for one reason, it's a gigantic work. It's enormous, right, in scope. And I don't think we can do much with it in 8 weeks. And second of all, it doesn't explicitly engage with the question of the syllogism, which is relevant for us. Although it does, of course, in many indirect ways. But the interesting thing is, if you encounter certain concepts in the categories, you will encounter them again in the Metaphysics, and they're obviously different. They're redefined, they're expanded, they're changed. But with the categories, we're dealing with sort of more or less outlines of fundamental ideas. The first 4 chapters are more fully developed. That's what he seems to emphasize, and then the rest are sort of more skeletal. But that's what we have to work with, so that's what we have to do. Okay, so how do we dive into this? maybe we can dive in by first, I just want to make a clarifying comment about some concepts like diaresis, and then offer a few general thoughts about the placement of the categories and sort of what could be Aristotle's goal in writing this book, this text, and then we can literally dive in, chapter 1, book 1, book 2, book 3. If we get through book 5 by the end of today, that'll be great. If not, we don't care. We can go as slowly as we need to, and then. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind, just as a side, is this notion of diaresis, which is an ancient Greek philosophical notion. Plato uses it, pre-Socratics use it, Aristotle uses it. So diaresis is a division of because the spellings. Can people read this, or is it too faint?
Is there a black marker, Arto?
Yes, it's a key.
There was yesterday. Yeah.
There's a
Well, do you want me to draw another circle, or you want?
There was a black one. Worked pretty well.
You want to bring the thing up?
What about vinyl? Would this work?
I think, no, I didn't bring it to that. I had a good
That's better?
one yesterday.
So, in the background of everything here, diaresis is lurking as a conceptual tool for Aristotle to grapple and to not lose control of the hierarchies that he's established and the relations and the meanings, right? And diaresis simply means it's a division. It's a form of classification from the general to the more specific. And in this process, from the more general to the more specific, humans, Aristotle is saying, or is implying, form concepts, conceptualization. They begin to make sense of the world that they live in, if they want to do that, right? So the act of studying, the act of making sense of the world in a systematic way, for Aristotle at least, requires this grappling of something that is general in terms of its features, that you are able to describe as such, and something that is general, and essentially its constitutive parts, which are much more specific, concrete, and in some way more easily graspable. Now, the example we have in Aristotle's work, where he explicitly applies this way of making sense of the world, of studying something, by making this movement from the general to the part, from the whole to the part, or in more updated philosophical language, the universal to the singular in Hegel, through the particular, is for example, in Aristotle's Politics, where in the very beginning of the Politics, which is Aristotle's application, if you will, of his methodological works, which are the Organon, and so on and so forth, Aristotle says, how do you study something that's very complicated, that's beyond us to comprehend as one thing? For example, politics. The world that you live in, the social world that you live in, is extremely complicated. So how do you grapple with it and do political analysis to understand how your society is structured by you and the other humans that you are in a relation with? And he says, well, you have to begin by breaking the whole of politics into its constitutive parts. And by doing that, you have a better chance of actually building concepts and building knowledge about the political world that you live in than if you just approach the whole thing as such. Yes?
Is the diaresis approach, does that mean, when you say they do look into totality, say the American landscape of politics right now, and you would break down the constituent parts, you talk about, say, the left and the right and the da-da-da-da, or does it mean that it's more like repeated form in a smaller singular?
It's not repeated. It's a qualitatively, quantitatively, relationally, in all the different categories. Mm-hmm. It's in all those different ways is different. The concrete.
Okay, so it's like a clock.
But
So the clock has many different parts to
yes,
make it work.
but at the
so well.
same time, it is possible to have substances for universal things or top level things, if you will, to also exist in the local level in a local way. So, for example, you can have substance, as he says later on in the categories. You can have substance, which is a universal, which he calls secondary substances, but you can also have a substance that's a primary substance, which is a particular thing. We'll get to these, right?
Okay.
So in other words, if you want to study American politics, the example he gives, if we start there, he says, think about you. You have a name, you have a particular identity as a person, you have a particular physical presence, you, the way you look, the way you sound, the way you think, right? Everything about you that is has particularities, particular specific features, including the thing that is uniquely you, right? Your fingerprints, for example, right? Fingerprints are supposed to be unique. And also the retina, right? The retina. What's
That's
that?
actually largely a myth.
That's largely a myth, forget it. Right?
But I know what you mean.
Right. So there may not be anything.
Can I glance at your book a minute?
Sure. You're right.
So for Aristotle, the diaresis is basically, most schematically, it's genera or genus, species, and individual things. So you have you have mammals, you have Homo sapiens, and then you have the individual you. There's no point in studying mammals as such in order to understand anything about American politics. This is why Aristotle says later on, some substances are much more immediately useful and thus more fundamental and primary and important to us. That's the level of the particular for Aristotle. Because that studies you and me and us and how we live. Mm-hmm. You shouldn't think about politics by focusing on the level of genus for Aristotle, right? Now, Plato disagrees, of course, in a certain sense, but we don't care about that because
Thank you.
then we'll never finish, you know. But so I think this is an important thing that's lurking in the background as Aristotle is trying to understand something incredibly complicated. What is he trying to understand on a fundamental level? What is his guiding question? There's several guiding questions. The first guiding question is the most fundamental philosophical question. What does it mean for something to exist or not? And if something exists, so what? What is the meaning that we can derive from that? Like, it exists how? It exists how? This is a fundamental question that all the great thinkers wrestled with. For example, just to give a radically different thinker who studied Aristotle, maybe not Heidegger, the great German philosopher of the 20th century, who was, he was not a Marxist, he was a great figure of the right-wing revolutionary subjectivity, right? And Heidegger has also in his lectures asked the question, what does it mean to exist rather than not, right? And that's his starting point and his meditation from which he builds, So Aristotle was sort of asking this on one level. What does it mean for something to exist? We exist, so what? We're human beings, right? We exist.
Do we?
He would say, he would say we do, but if we assume that we do, what are the consequences of that? There are many. Some consequences may be, okay, I exist, how should I live my life? Should I even pose that question? Well, you should, because you have the ability to ask it, so you might as well do it, right? Because we have this inherent ability to think in a certain way, rational way or whatever. So that question comes up, so you have to engage it because it came up by you or by somebody like you, another human being. So do not dismiss the questions that seem to be important to you and follow the question until you get answers that satisfy you. Yes?
Just going back to genus,
Yeah.
we're taking the example of politics. Would
Okay.
the genus be, let's say, the stars, the ether, or would it be the term politics and then under that subcategory American politics and so on and so forth?
It's a great question. I mean, I'm going to ask everyone else, but just as an initial step, I could say depending on how careful we are and how I don't want to say smart, but how insightful we are about establishing the limits of what is the universal in this case. If we talk about matter and the planet itself as the starting point of the most general thing that humans are connected to, that might be too broad, right? So what would be the universal, the level of the universal, the most general, if we want to study politics using the diaresis?
I think it should be what's being
included and what's being disavowed in the official discourse.
Okay,
So
interesting,
for
because
example,
the official discourse you're saying is by nature particular.
So for example, the general discourse, that whenever we encounter a certain crisis, we almost instinctively label it as some sort of humanitarian crisis. So the whole humanist discourse, what's being disavowed, maybe we could consider as the universal. So for example, for the liberal mind, for the centrist, what's so traumatic and scandalous would be the notion of the class struggle.
Class struggle.
It makes no sense for almost everybody. So
That's the accepted wisdom you're saying, right? That in some sense.
Or that it's simply something that an ordinary person or maybe even intellectual wouldn't want to engage in. And
So you're saying, so just as a working example for you, in the study of the political, the most general level, the equivalent of a genus might be class struggle itself.
it might come about as class struggle, but I'm really hesitant to posit it as something that's out there, that's primary. So when it comes about through the negative.
And you already used the word, so we should say a couple of words before we go back, but the notion of the negative or the negation is a fundamentally important concept in Aristotle, who proposes through the language of contraries, right? Anticipating Hegel. And for Hegel, of course, all change, all movement, all learning happens through the process of negation. And of course, it's negation, and then it's negation. And not, right? So the concept, studying something and understanding something through what's excluded in that way is a very important and useful thing. But what would be the equivalent of the genera or the genus in political analysis today? I don't know. That's a complicated question. It depends on how we set our sights. But that could be one example. Or some people have already said that the world itself that we inhabit, whatever you want to call it, the planet, you know, if you want to take an sort of like an environmental perspective, right? That's the most general level of our being. And then from there, you can sort of become more and more particularized and more specific and talk about it, the economies of the world economy, economies of regions, NAFTA, the economies of individual nation states. Then you can have a parallel particularization strand of maybe looking at social classes. And then you can have all these sort of different, it's like the tree branches to roots, the trunk analogy that has been used in this case, yeah. But it's up to you to sort of decide in a certain sense what makes sense to you as the most general level of this thing called the political.
Well, in the ancient Greek language, politia, which is actually the real title of the republic, which is a very bad translation.
It has nothing to do with republic.
It has nothing to do with republic or republicanism, which has been taken up by scholars for many times, especially the liberal class of historians and philosophers have always trying to put it in the republican tradition, right. You know, ever since modernity with Hobbes
and we should remember,
right.
Republican forms of government are a Roman invention.
Right.
They did not exist in ancient
Exactly.
Greece. This is almost like a pre-imperial formation that allows a certain effective centralization while permitting certain type of access to power by the demos. So it's a dialectical relationship of contradictions that are involved in the Republican form, which the American founders, of course, understood very well. How do you maintain a position of political power for your social class? In the case of the founders, these were wealthy property owners, and these people were politically brilliant. And they were like, how do we create a government where we are in position of political power and we make the decisions, while at the same time minimize the resistance, the political resistance that might come from the other social class, which does not own sufficient wealth? Well, you create a republican mechanism that is controlled through indirect elections, right? Representations. You vote for somebody else who represents you in government. This is a Roman invention that Aristotle, this would not make sense to Aristotle in the way it was done.
I don't want to get off track, but isn't it also that there were times as well, but this like in ancient Greece,
There
you had
were.
a very stratified structure. That was
But it wasn't racial slavery.
no.
It was more like indentured servitude. I mean, I'm not saying that it was good, you know. It's certainly.
I mean, the only free men who could vote were the non-slaves, so it was very stratified.
And the police essentially were slaves.
Well, I mean, as Marx has pointed out.
I'm sorry, could you ask him to repeat that question?
Yeah, that was good. So you were saying.
It's getting too far, maybe something else will take us off the topic, but to compare to ancient Greece, the thing is that maybe it's a missing component if we don't look at that. The society assumed a certain structure that wasn't even dealt with in any kind of democratic fashion, so to say.
Yeah.
You just simply had a slavery class
Yeah.
that had no rights to.
So it's not a real democracy the way we would think about it in terms of the French Revolution, for example, in its radical phase.
They were not accounted for.
Right. In the French Revolution, the initial idea of the Jacobins was that you would create a society where everybody who's French will participate in a certain way, which was representative nonetheless. But you're saying, and I think that's correct, that was certainly more democratic than the Athenian way in a certain sense if we measure the percentage of the Athenians who were actually citizens. They were in the minority.
Right. My point is more to drive at that in the Roman structure empire, there was more of a bureaucratic accounting for various figures. I don't know.
Which was necessary because it was an empire over
So then you had a
huge
different
terrain.
problem because you had more people named, so to speak, within the structural.
Yes.
Well, I was just going to go back to this notion of politia. The poli is the many, and the tia, really the many are coming together. So in terms of this notion of genus, where this discussion started for Aristotelian lens, is the politia is really the many that are gathered or come together in a way. So it's probably best to look at it that way and then go into the species and the differentia and that, and to think of politics that way. And this is how Aristotle would think of politics, because always in his ethics, politics is considered the master science above all.
Because in the
Always,
political
already.
community, things happen that determine the shape and functioning and existence or not of all the other communities. So it's almost like to do it in a very ugly and schematic way, it's almost like sets. So for example, if this circle represents the political community of the United States as a whole, meaning the people who live here and are daily sort of engaged in living here and doing all the things that entails in many different ways, if this is the political community, this is the highest community for Aristotle, because whatever happens in here on this level of gathered togetherness conditions directly and indirectly all the other communities that have formed within it.
Well, including science, including, drive
Ideas,
for knowledge,
laws,
and ethical behavior
business.
and everything.
That's right. This is why, much later in human history, where you have explicit political philosophic works that influence actual politics, in the modern context, after the French Revolution, for example, the primary political battle is who's going to control the state. Because the understanding is if you control the state, you overwhelmingly shape and overdetermine, or you can at least have a shot at overdetermining all the different communities, if you choose to, that have formed within the domain. Now, this may sound like a liberal reduction or a Marxist reduction or whatever, but it's a historical fact that the prime political battles have happened in many different ways for control of the state apparatus, broadly defined, not just government per se, but cultural spaces, production of ideology, and so on and so forth. Science and domination in science, and thinking, setting the agenda.
Well, I would have two comments. Aristotle was a biologist before he was a philosopher.
That's true. He did spend a lot of time studying.
These books reflect the time when he was a biologist. He had not yet started to think about politics. I think that's
a very important point, because he did write those treatises, right?
And I think it's very dangerous to think of slaves as a social class, because you can certainly say some social classes have lifestyles similar to slaves, but slavery has persisted in every society for millennia, and it has a property. A slave is a property. A slave is not a member of a social class. And I remember when we were still at CUNY, there were African students who talked about the fact that slavery was still practiced in Africa. So it's a property conception, and if you're going to look at it in Marxist terms, you have to look at it in terms of property, not as a social class.
Yes, and in terms of, and we can also think about it in terms of the concepts of the European Enlightenment, or Marx himself, and sort of think of slaves as people who are, the whole note. We can get into the whole related notions of political power and oppression, and what is oppression really? It's a complicated question because it has to do with loss of autonomy over the self.
But there's a difference in being regarded in a society as a piece of property. That is a different conception of a person, of a human being.
Yes, you're right. So we shouldn't make that reductive argument when we talk about
this. We should be very clear on that difference.
It's true. Yeah. Yes.
I don't know a lot about Athenian society, but if the notion of political community is not equivalent to the state, what other form of togetherness did he have in mind?
He did have a conception of the state. In fact, in the Politics, he has a taxonomy of 6 different types of states that exist.
Right, but you said earlier that political community didn't mean state, or did I mishear you?
If I said that, then that's wrong.
Well, it was a city-state, it wasn't the
But it wasn't a state in the modern, it wasn't a centralized bureaucracy the way it exists
not
today.
a nation state.
It was a different type of a...
Fine, it's not a nation state, but it has sovereignty, no?
It had sovereignty.
It had sovereignty.
Yeah. It enforced its borders. It had a military arm that was volunteer. Plato served in the military as a citizen. Okay, I think this is very good. So far, we're in book 1. Okay, good. That's okay.
We're still sorting out the dialectics.
This is as Heidegger always begins in his lectures. Now we're at the beginning of the introduction to the introductory argument, which sets up the fundamental question. And I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is. We can't study something seriously by simplifying these discussions. I'm very happy that we collectively did not.
Again,
and we had these extraordinary kind of amplifications, And the point about biology is very true. I totally forgot about that.
He grew out of that. But
he grew out of that. Those were his earliest works.
And
his father
was a doctor.
Was a doctor. Yeah, that's true.
But this kind of distinction had not been made earlier.
Right.
So
it's interesting to note also, vis-a-vis language, if you did not speak Greek, you were a barbaros, which is the etymological, material etymology of the word barbarian.
Right.
The other people were considered barbaros if they did not speak Greek.
That's a form of early chauvinism, because next to the Greeks were the Thracians, which we're only now. I'm from Bulgaria originally, so the Thracian ruins are everywhere. But the problem is we don't know much about the Thracians because they were much before the ancient Greek city-states emerged, and they didn't have a writing, they didn't have a written, they didn't have a alphabet, so they had a complicated way of sort of a pre-alphabet type of record keeping, which is very fragile, But there were certainly ancient civilizations that were overlapping with the ancient Greeks that had similar levels of economic, political complexity, minus the written word, and thus we don't know much about them. But the barbaros is certainly, that's the root of the word. You do not speak our language.
That's how it was framed up. And speaking of chauvinism, modern philosophy is German chauvinism.
Absolutely.
It's really about the German language is somewhat akin to the Greek language, the ancient Greeks, and they basically invented Greece again. With the English Romantics. These are
nothing to do with ancient Greece, not even Byzantine
Empire.
Empire.
From the Germans, right?
Heidegger says that barbarian is those who do not ask the question.
But see, that's something worth putting on the board, because that's a fundamental disposition in how to think on this level. So asking the question, and of course it has to be the correct question.
There's only one question.
I wouldn't use correct.
Not correct, proper, appropriate. Heidegger's being, the first, correct is a positive term. The first 56 pages or so of Heidegger's Being and Time are obsessively focused on how to arrive at the appropriate question of his subject of investigation. All the German philosophers do that. Aristotle does it his own way, you'll see. And we don't do it in the modern academia where I'm supposed to write a paper where I present my argument as an accomplished fact in the first paragraph. It's like, how am I going to do that if I don't know what I'm asking? The purpose of writing is to come up with a question first, and then maybe answer it in subsequent chapters. So asking the question, this becomes the fundamental disposition, sort of position, opening yourself to thinking in that. But thinking doesn't just mean here, but thinking is acting, and vice versa. There's no separation between idea and things, in Aristotle. So asking the question, and also the negative, the negation of this. If you never ask the question, it's over. I mean, that's basically the foreclosure of the human being or of the political society that never asks the question. That's the end. That's almost like a non-human function. Automated existence. Usually means subordinated to some other humans. Kant wrote it in the essay that you taught. The relationship of domestication for Kant was, the meaning of that was to be in a dependent relationship because you do not have the ability to make sense of the world on your own. You don't know how to think. So that you would never ask questions. So you'd always use the questions that others ask for you, and you would simply execute the answers that they asked and they provided the answer for. Right? And that is sort of for Kant, as a liberal thinker of the highest order, that's the definition of an unfree society.
And which sets up the guardian class. You need a class of people to tell you, such as the Aspen Institute or the Open Society, whatever, how to think, how to direct these thoughts, etc., etc.
But there are tensions here, because Jefferson, for example, was much more open to Kant in that sense. Jefferson believed that he would want to live in a society where people ask questions. What is that famous quote to Jefferson? He'd be called a terrorist today. The liberty, the tree of liberty. The tree of liberty requires nourishment, regular nourishment, with the blood of martyrs and enemies. I mean, Jefferson said this, and everybody understood that in his lifetime.
Right. John Brown took
Life
that
is
up
struggle.
a little more extreme.
Life is struggle, Jefferson said.
But I think,
if you want to be free.
But I think that the quote from Jefferson could, forgive me being very cynical, but I think it might be interesting. In a very cynical way, it could be read that effectively the United States, as the beacon of liberty and democracy, is actually doing it right now.
It could be interpreted like that, true.
Starting wars and drone strikes and preventive attack on rogue countries and so on and so forth. And also, I think the notion of asking the appropriate question as the fundamental disposition of thinking, but I think this notion of the fundamental of asking the right question comes about only after you have asked the right question. So in a way, the whole series of liberty, the whole Enlightenment notion of freedom, in a way, is sort of retroactively invented only after you have asked the right question. And the whole notion of liberty, dignity, and freedom is somehow posited as the eternal past, as at the moment the inception of the event takes place.
I think we can maybe rephrase it in the sense that something like this might suggest that the ground, or the root, or however we want to think about it, of a certain way of living as a human being has to be rooted in you. Right? So in other words, different people have called it differently. Some people have called it relations that start from you and return to you. Right? So human, this is sort of like another important idea that I wanted to get later when we did Hegel, but the notion that what is the idea of subjectivity in politics, right? How do we think about that? Can we still think about that, right? So these become, I think, very important and useful ideas. But, for example, there's a notion from Heidegger and your teacher, Rainer Schurmann, the German philosopher who taught at the New School for many years, that what defines the throwing money?
Yeah, dropping.
What defines
Dropping,
what
that's
defines politics in the modern context is the existence of three specific relations, social relations, recursive relations that return to myself, near myself, and for myself. Right? And this would be compatible with Aristotle because, as we'll see, Aristotle grounds everything in sort of human ontology.
Did you say nearby and for?
Yeah.
To myself, for myself, and nearby myself.
Near myself, for myself, and by myself. Sorry, near my return to myself, to near myself, and to for myself. I will expand on this. I didn't want to mention this now because it's going to take us into a very specific kind of space between Hegel and Marx, but we'll come back to that. Right now, let's just leave it as something that's like a question. I just want to sort of add a few general statements that I thought at least are helping me think about the beginning of the categories. So what is Aristotle's concern here? And I'm just going to throw a few ideas and then just as a starting point, my interpretation simply, not what Aristotle is saying necessarily, although I will use some of his words as well. So Aristotle's organon, this body, this instrument that he's building, is simply an instrument for capturing the truth. Aristotle uses the word the truth, right? So Aristotle is engaged with fundamental investigations, and he's trying to do originary thinking. But what is the truth, right? So how does he understand the truth? And here there's an interesting quote from the Metaphysics. So for Aristotle, something that is true is the correspondence of thinking and being. So the truth is a correspondence of thought with being. And here's the quote from the Metaphysics. He says, "To speak of the true means to say that something that exists is, and something that does not exist is not." But of course, in order to be able to differentiate that, right, you're going to have to sort of create a vocabulary that enables you to differentiate what exists from what doesn't exist. It seems like an impossible task. It's very difficult, but it's always the fundamental task. I have two other examples of
Would you repeat that last sentence? Vocabulary which allows us to differentiate between...
To speak of the true means to say that something that exists is, and something that does not exist is not. How do you tell the difference between that? How do you delineate, and what kind of vocabulary can you build that accurately captures, for example, the human condition, which is particular because we all die, but yet we have the capacity to think of the universal. We have the capacity to imagine that which doesn't exist in a certain material sense, but exists in other ways, metaphysically, right? So all these complexities that are part of what it means to be human need to be made sense of somehow, to the best of our ability. Yeah.
And vocabulary.
And the one tool that we have to make sense of something like that is to engage with human language. So there's a linguistic component to Aristotle's study of what is being, what am I, and what is us, and what is this called life. There's a linguistic component. This is why he focuses on predication. Subject-predicate relations in human sentences in English. If we think about them carefully, of how we structure sentences and how we don't, and will tell us a lot about being, a lot about us as such, on all the different levels of experience. At the same time, simultaneously, when you read a sentence in English, you can also interpret it ontologically and not simply linguistically, through grammar. You do both at the same time, right? So grammatical meaning carries automatically ontological meaning, ontos or onta, the being. It has meaning directly, that says something directly about you as such, a person, a class, a group of people, whatever the division might be or the category might be. So every time we say Michael is a philosopher, we can analyze that grammatically. The subject is Michael. The predicate is Michael is, right? So there's a certain grammatical truth in that. There's a certain truth in that analysis. That there's a certain alignment in meaning of what Michael is in relation to is a philosopher. Is, of course, is another important part, right? But in addition to the grammatical meaning of that sentence, we are saying something real about Michael and who he is, assuming we're being honest and accurate. We're saying Michael, there is a person called Michael Pelias. Michael Pelias exists, right? He's a philosopher, which means somebody who studies, whatever your definition is, right? Studies being.
Right.
So in Aristotle's, and this is an interesting question, and I'm not a student of Wittgenstein or these other great 20th century thinkers who dealt with the linguistic turn in philosophy. But Aristotle never studies language. His interest in language is not purely linguistic. It's always ontological, right? And linguistic. So there's two sets of meanings that he's interested in understanding if they're true or false, eventually in his logic and his syllogisms. The grammatical meaning, which is actually less important. That's just a means to understand the ontological. In other words, he wants to understand the real alita, something really concretely true and real about you, right? Something that describes the real you or the whole you in all of your complexity, if possible, right? This is not an ideological study, right? He's not interested in studying something in a Machiavellian way, like in The Prince, where the seeming focus is, using language, for example, in ways to, or behaving in a certain way that you justify to others, make them fear you in order to accomplish a political goal. I mean, Machiavelli was being very serious there. He was trying to explain how power functions in politics on one level. On another level, there's other things. So with Aristotle, there is an interest in truth. What is truth is essentially the correspondence of thinking with being. When I think about you, am I thinking accurately about you? In a sense that am I actually describing or comprehending things that are part of your being? Or am I simply perceiving you or thinking about you in ways that are not truthful? They have nothing to do with your being, that are disaligned with your understanding, with your actual functioning as a human being right now in this particular configuration. You can almost see here the importance of later extensions to this focus, ontological focus on being, through the linguistic, in terms of when somebody says, you didn't carefully analyze the situation. Or what is your political strategy for winning the presidential election of 2020? And somebody can be like, the Democrats and Hillary misread, right, a particular swing state predisposition. They misread the actual living conditions and the actual things that motivated some of those swing state voters. They'll be like, that's why you lost the election. Well, there was a misalignment there, right? You did not capture, if you will, that being, meaning those voters that you needed to swing to your party in that state to capture the election. So there's a certain important practical consideration to discovering the truth when necessary in a specific everyday context. But how do you do that?
So are they empirical observations or?
Yes, that's part of it. And thus, if you want to read the initial list of how you do that, that's the categories.
Right.
So if you understand the difference between the different categories, you can use them to apply correctly to whether you're studying an empirical situation connected to a being, to some being, what human being in relation to some kind of an environmental context, the fires in California, in relation to the way the electrical grid is made, and for example. So here are the different ways through which you can capture being in a true way. You can observe what kind of a substance a being is, a quantity, a quality. You can observe the relations that are formed between beings. and of course there's subcategories, there are gradations of relations. Are they relations of sort of equality, if you will, to use a modern language? Are there relations of inequality or dependency? There's location and place categories of where, right? When, temporal dimensions, right, to our being, to our existence, that have to be accurately discussed. Posture, attitude, having something, doing an action, affecting or being affected, right? So there are 10, for Aristotle, there are 10 ways through which being can be harnessed or made sense of or understood somehow beyond sort of surface, immediate responses, which may be true or not. They may not align with, yes?
Okay, I'm not sure I followed you. I understand the categories that you listed, but was substance a category?
It's the most fundamental category.
Okay.
And the substance later becomes known as the subject. So the substance is the foundation upon which everything else acts or requires to act. Certain substances are more fundamental than others. The most fundamental substance is you, the individual human being. So it's a profound inversion where Aristotle places the most fundamental building block of human life on the individual human being, on human beings as particular creatures, not on general humanity as such. That's the most fundamental. Why? Because everything we do in life, the way we relate to, in order to relate to someone, you have to relate, you have to have the ability to make a relation to something else that already exists, right? So the substance of which a particular substance in a certain way that he calls primary, which in our language, in his language, but in our language more likely, we call the particular human being. That's the grounding for Aristotle of humans and the way we make sense of the world. Yes. For Marx too. For Hegel too. For, I can't think of someone who doesn't do that grounding after Aristotle. Maybe until very recently. Maybe until very recently. Yes.
Well, only that,
maybe today Google is the ground, is the substance, and we're defining relation to it. And maybe it happens. Homo datum instead of Homo economicus.
I think in Freud and Lacan it's a bit complicated. It's the unconscious. It's the unconscious. So substances.
But that's still, so then the question is the unconscious something that's in you or of you or both?
Right.
Or not in you but of you? Or not of you but in you or neither? Or so the permutations will tell us a lot, right? If we, yes. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's simply that if I got it right, substance is essentially the essence. And with respect to people, he uses the term soul, and I don't want to get off on a tangent.
I mean, we can just right now go just for a second to chapter 5 where he begins with this, right?
Yeah.
So if we go to chapter 5, we have an initial thing. Later I will add more words that are more derivative words that he doesn't talk about, but they are kind of implied like particular, universal. You know, Aristotle doesn't use necessarily that language, but that language has emerged later as people have made sense of these cryptic comments by using his examples. But a substance, that which is called a substance, most strictly, primarily, and most of all, I mean, there are qualifiers here, is that which is neither said of a subject nor is in a subject. For example, an individual human being, the individual man, or the individual horse. It doesn't have to be human beings, right? But of course, he's primarily interested in human beings because he's interested in human ontology. Well, yes. Michael, you were wanting to say something.
Well, I was just going to say substance is ousia.
It
It's
is
the word
ousia,
that
yeah.
is used, right?
Yes.
And substance goes through many definitions. The first definition is form.
That's the more
It's the form
Platonic
of the thing.
definition.
Yeah, that's right, but he's changing that, right? And then, so a substance of a triangle is a three-sided figure. That would be one way of looking at this, at least in a very elementary way.
Yes.
And then he differentiates, as you said, between the primary and the secondary substances, right? You know, one is individual substance, like the individual tree, or the individual yourself, right? Or the house, or whatever.
But I want to add something to what you just said.
No
So
problem.
ousia in
Just to
Aristotle
keep it,
as
you
well,
know, yeah.
ousia, substance,
Right,
or the subject,
right.
which becomes later, in Aristotle, but also later in Hegel.
I don't really understand how to make sense of what.
So let me add the
you're
comment.
saying with respect to the primary.
Okay, so let me add, so first of all, substance is ousia, for Aristotle, has connotations of something that is, probably the best word in English is beingness. Something that exists, has a shape and form that's formed. Something that is formed it exists. It has borders to it, like an individual tree, for example, or you as an individual human being. There's a beingness about you. You're a being, but not just in a general kind of vague sense of a live creature, right? A primary substance is a beingness that is defined. It has a certain shape and form, and it exists as a standalone thing. It does not need other things in order to exist on this basic fundamental level. And because it exists as a basic building block, other things use it in order to actualize themselves. For example, a relation between things required things to already exist. For Aristotle, right? Now, a quantum physicist might say the quanta is purely random, and electrons and elementary particles get created and disappear. Fine, that's 2,000 years after Aristotle. But for Aristotle, and remember, Aristotle doesn't have the notion of negative numbers either. That's why he makes these kind of strange sounding comments about numbers. That the number 3 doesn't have its contrary. Well, and what about -3? There's no -3 in Aristotle's world, right? So there's certain limitations. But give the guy credit, 2,400 years ago. So the substance is a complicated notion of he's trying to determine why should we ground everything in humans and not in trees, for example, or not in some god, not in Zeus. Why is not Aristotle's metaphysics, his ontology, why is it not grounded in, for example, a Christian medieval philosopher would ground everything in God? Because to him, God is a substance that's secondary. It only exists because people made a substance called God, because that only makes sense to people. Because panthers cannot deal or form a relation or make sense of the notion of God, right? So Aristotle is saying, if I want to make sense of what does it mean to be me, or what does it mean to be human, and what does it mean to exist in my form, it seems most reasonable to ground myself in me as the starting and fundamental substance, building block. Why? Because everything that makes sense to me and happens to me or doesn't make sense to me seems to be related to me, or start from me, or end with me. Right? So the fire can burn me. When we create a relationship based on class, that only makes sense when I deal with other people. When somebody says, "Oh wow, you went to the beach and you have a tan. Your physical appearance changed." Well, what changed? Your physical appearance changed, right? So everything is grounded in us, and thus that should be seemingly the fundamental grounding block of our starting point of how we think about what life is. I don't know if that made sense. That's what Marx says, literally. Marx grounds, right, the starting point of what life is in human social relations.
Okay, but that doesn't sound like me.
It does, because you are in relations.
I know that. I don't think Aristotle knows that.
Without you, there's no relation.
Aristotle will say all of his examples are about people, right? All the fundamental examples describe situations that people are in. Socrates is walking. Socrates is a human being. Socrates was whiter before, and now he is darker. Yes, sorry.
It seems to relate back to what you had said earlier about linguistics being his kind of discovery, or I presume his discovery of linguistics being integral to the idea of subjectivity and ontology, like the idea of self construction through language.
And of course, language is a fundamentally human thing, in the sense that it's the thing that enables us to simply actualize our existence. Without the ability to use or deploy language in many different ways, whether it's through art or through spoken words or hearing or listening or touching or feeling or whatever, and then the meanings that we create from it, we will not be able to function as humans. In other words, we would function either as gods or other beasts, he would say, in the politics.
Yeah, and it seems to me
Okay.
that this is very.
But sticking to human beings,
Oh, I'm just saying
Sorry,
that this
we'll just
seems
go
to
ahead.
be very fundamentally tied into the notion of usia.
Yes. Yes.
Fundamentally
Can a
tied
slave
into
act-
To the notion of usia, substance. We will say a lot more once we get to it, I'm sure, but this is a good kind of, yes.
can a slave, a subject of a slave, can a slave actualize his existence?
A slave can learn.
The slave is already. The slave is a person already, is a human, right? It's just that there are particular qualities. The slave as a primary substance, as a subject, right? Now don't think of subject necessarily in the more modern context here. Like a slave does not have a subjectivity because they don't have political rights. They don't exist as citizens or subjects of politics in that sense, perhaps. You might say in a more recent modern political language. Aristotle will simply say, I'm using subject in a different way. I'm using subject to denote a primary substance, an example of which is a particular beingness that already exists as
But a
such.
slave is a particular being.
Absolutely. Of a particular type.
Of a particular.
A slave, he might say, has a particular quality to their subjectness, which is called slavery. But they are a primary
The
substance.
police are slaves in ancient Greece.
Well, but the question is
They're slaves to the citizens.
self-actualization, which you mentioned, and so my question was, can a slave self-actualize?
Well, from Aristotle's point of view in the categories, he wouldn't reach that level of analysis, right? So he would simply say, I'm interested in the more fundamental, more primal, if you will, or originary conceptualization of what a human being is in the first place in G, right? He would confront that argument in his Politics, where he talks about slavery, right? That some people are born that have a nature which predisposes them to have the qualities of servitude or servantness. And thus, it is appropriate for them to be servants, because then they would function most fully as human beings, as somebody else's servants, because that's part of their nature, right? That's what Aristotle would say in the Politics. But that's a second level analysis after this. Here he's basically saying, what is the fundamental way through which we can understand of what we are as human beings in general, outside of the other qualifications, if we can, of slavery, of working class, wealthy, American, Turkish, whatever. Yes.
I was just gonna say, it seems like if he cites the individual horse as a subject, as a substance, so it doesn't seem like he means self-actualization in this liberal sense of
No.
actualizing your abilities. It's more about just being there as a single thing, right?
As an actualized thing already, irrespective of your very fine-grained specificities, like your political ideology or your gender, or he's not interested about any of these, what he would call probably, or today we might call second or third level from the most fundamental category concerns. They're not less important. It's just that he's not interested in that when he's asking the fundamental question, what is being, right? And how do we approach this? Yeah. I think this is good because these words mean very different things. Subject, substance. Substance also sounds like something that you smell in a church or something when they burn the incense or something. There's all kinds of meanings, but we have to clear those meanings out. Yeah.
Can we just do a quick kind of genealogy of substance from pre-Socratics? So let's say we have, air, aperon, right? Then we have water first, of course.
Yeah.
And then you have, what do you have after that? It's fire,
Fire.
Yes.
right? And then
The
Parmenides
elements,
says,
basically the elements, right?
right.
The elements of
Yeah.
the
And
natural.
then
then
just
the
to go to her point,
Then the question becomes an ontological question.
right?
It's not a question of origin anymore, it's the beingness.
Okay.
Whether something is or is
That's
not.
Plato and Aristotle.
This
Right.
is basically the Parmenidean question of where the first treatise on logical contradiction comes from.
Okay.
Right, in a way, what can be and what cannot be.
Right.
How can they both
This is not
coexist?
Aristotle's
What
invention,
is the
Right,
is and the
exactly.
this
is.
question.
So he's following on the Parmenidean moment of which he recounts in the metaphysics.
And the
etc.
Heraclitus, where everything is changed. The
Yeah.
fundamental energies
Exactly.
change. And Aristotle, as you know, in one of the books, discusses explicitly what change is. Right? And that's his continuation of Heraclitus' line of thinking.
So one way of looking at this, I mean, in terms of layers, if you want to, I mean, maybe for another form of explication, would be to see this question of substance, ousia, both on the level of the grammatical subject, right, in a sense.
In a sentence, for example,
right?
the thing that grounds the sentence.
Well, that's where we are
The
now.
thing that,
that's where we are.
and I'm going to do that
And
right
then
now.
we do
in
the
last-
ontological,
Yeah,
which
because
would be the being of that predication, etc. So you have these layers between the grammatical, right,
Which is
and the ontological that's operating
at the same
because
time.
Aristotle is the first to pose the question of what is the being of beings, or what is being. This is the Heideggerian fascination, if you will, with Aristotle, the wonderment about the being of beings, or the being of
Remember, in the metaphysics,
Tito on is the Greek where the ontology comes. What is it to be? But this meaning that we still bring up today. I mean, we have this in modernity with Paul Tillich, the courage to be, being in time, and Heidegger.
Remember
being in existence,
in the metaphysics of
in
Aristotle,
nothingness. All these titles are out of the, obviously out of the ontologies of
in
the
the
ancients.
Aristotle's metaphysics, the beautiful question is, what does it mean to wonder? Right?
Yes.
As the initial motivation for wrestling, what does it mean to wonder? Wonderment, openness, receiving, engaging. I mean, there's all kinds of metaphors that you can use to build. I know you had a question. Any more questions? I know you had a question.
Oh, that was 8 minutes.
Well, to put it in
Are you sure you wanna-
Lacanian terms, the desire is to know. It's also scopophilia, to see, right, as well. And also the question of Arto, this extreme curiosity, if you will, but thaumatasine is a verb to wonder, which is where all philosophical speculation.
I mean, my
and
kind of
philosophizing
speculative
comes
interpretation
from.
of Aristotle's, like one of his fundamental drives, is above all, in a good society, in his politics, he differentiates between sort of good and perverted constitutions, right? Good are aligned with sort of the goal being achievement of the good life, the fully actualized, developed life on the community level and individual level per se, is this real emphasis on constantly being open to wonderment. This is a philosophy against automated existence. This is a philosophy that sneers at simple machine-like base existence as a sick existence. I mean, this is the standard here. He's only interested in driving, if you will, politically, ultimately, for a society that in many different ways is open to wonderment as the basic human condition. Right? I mean, this is why this is so attractive to so many people in history, from Hegel to Marx to today. Now, I just want to do for 10 minutes just a basic kind of rundown of some of these concepts like category, subject, predicate, and then maybe we can use that as a jumping in point to some sections in the categories, but at least it'll give us like a common. So the word categories, right? Categoria, to put together, to join, right? So this would be a straightforward linguistic, if you will, interpretation of that word. To categorize is to join together.
Or to have something in common, too.
To join together that
common
which has common characteristics, to classify, to order, right? And you can see how this fits with diaresis, right? So the categories. So what would be an example of categorizing something? So Aristotle always gives this sentence. For example, Socrates walks, or Socrates is walking. The boat is sinking. Now, it's a horrible thing. But what does that mean? So he's saying, okay, so if we want to sort of think about that sentence, Socrates walks. Clearly, there's predication involved here. Predication in the linguistic sense for now. So how can we make sense of predication? In the linguistic sense, right, when we say Socrates walks, we have a very clear analysis linguistically of that sentence, right? So the noun is the subject, and right, the verb is the predicate. Now, this is a linguistic reading of predication. What is the subject? The subject is the ground, the center of the sentence, upon which something happens that's qualified. Right? Socrates is walking. Socrates stopped walking. Socrates is old. Socrates is a philosopher. Socrates killed himself. Right? So the subject is the ground, the center sort of the action that gives meaning. This is what we, right? Our attention is pointed to Socrates, the subject. And the predicate is simply describing the thing that is happening to that part of the sentence that denotes the ground. Now, predication as an ontological matter, predication as an ontological thing, is not a relation between words per se. The relation between words, between the word Socrates is walking, the relationship is a subject-predicate relation, right? Linguistically, grammatically. But what is the ontological reading of predication that Aristotle is interested in? It's Socrates walks describes a relationship between beings. In addition to describing a relationship within an actual grammatical sentence, the grammatical relations within a sentence. What are the beings involved in the sentence Socrates walks? Socrates is a being. Walking is being, is a thing that is happening. Right? There's movement.
Process.
There's process. Yes, Socrates is walking, but there's walking happening, and there's also a human being that's there that's involved in that statement. And the two beings are in a relation, right? Socrates is not just Socrates in some general sense, a person, that would be, right? Socrates is actually specifically doing something. So, in that sense, there are two simultaneous things that are happening here. There's an ontological and there's a linguistic explanation of what is happening, which in this case is Socrates is walking. The economy has entered a recession. I don't know if that's a good example. I mean, it might be not particular enough. But there's a being there. There's the economy as such. And is entering a recession. That's some kind of a qualification. That is some kind of an affecting of the economy. The economy is experiencing a recession, right? So there is a linguistic analysis of that statement. Oh, the economy is not doing well. It's, the inflation rate went up and whatever the case might be. I can derive that meaning from simply reading the sentence. But at the same time, there's an actual meaning that is on the level of ontology, of being. The thing called economy, which is something real that we are part of, that affects us in many different ways, is now functioning in a way that's going to affect us in a specific way, because now unemployment is going to go up, or loans will become more expensive to borrow, and so on and so forth. Does that make sense, this distinction? Okay. So predication is an ontological matter, which Aristotle is focused in more than the linguistic, is a relationship between beings. And this is basically the focus of Aristotle in the categories.
I didn't hear you said it's a relationship
between beings. And Aristotle...
Plural. Beings.
Yes. Oh. Always plural, right? For us to make sense of being, there has to be more than one.
Fine. And
give you a modern example would be social relations determine consciousness.
Yeah.
Not the other way around.
Exactly.
Right.
Right?
So,
I mean,
so
the German
this
ideology, for
statement,
example.
the economy is in recession. Recession is a being.
Yeah.
And obviously the economy is a...
Yeah, and don't think of being as only a human being, right? He's using being as anything that is, that has substance, that has usia. There are different types of substances, of course, in terms of their functioning as far as we're concerned, from our point of view as humans. But the economy is a being, is a substance, right? And so is recession.
The economy is a category. It's a category for.
It's a category of type substance, for example.
Yes.
Right?
So what would not
That's
be
the-
a substance? An imaginatory thing of like a rabbit that speaks 17 languages?
Yeah, something that doesn't have material grounding. For Aristotle. That's why he's a materialist. He's a prototypical materialist. He's
The
only
last
interested.
definition of substance, as you go through the etymology, is real estate.
Is what?
Real
You wanna
estate.
catch it?
Real estate is substance.
The last definition that is given to usia in the etymological dictionaries is real estate. It's the seventh definition as you go forward. Yeah. So it may be good at some levels as Marxists to read real estate, as well, into this as the final definition.
And it doesn't violate
Right, it
the
doesn't
Aristotle's
violate the-
formulation,
no, of
right?
course.
Because real estate is.
Right.
We'll describe substance in more
So it's
detail
interesting,
as we get to it.
Is there any,
his materialist philosophy
Yeah.
is working.
does it become something like, Badiou's stress on that event, is something like Nazi Germany is not an event because it's not tied to the universal. So what I'm trying to get at is like, is it strictly simply imaginatory things versus this pen in front of me that we're talking about
No,
substance?
I think it's a difference between the idealist notion of form and the materialist definition of form. I think that's a good starting point, because the argument here is a lot with Plato's ideality of form.
It's an inversion of
Yeah,
Plato's
it's
notion
an
of
inversion.
the existing.
So you
And the
begin.
forms that exist that may be unseen, but they're actually truer, more
So-
real than
Right,
the sphere
form
that
of
exists out there in the world, which is the perfect three-dimensional shape and smooth and
pen
beautiful
or
and love.
something, yeah.
That's more real than a sphere that you hold in your hand.
Mhm.
Because, right, Aristotle does not think that way. It's almost the opposite. He's not interested in the perfect sphere that might be uncovered through our increasingly more precise and insightful thinking about spheres. No, he's interested in what is. And if what is, it's immediately incorporated into our sense-making apparatus, and we can wrestle with it. If we just study it through these various descriptors of the way things can be. They might have a quality, they might have a quantity to it, to themselves. They may not have quantity, but they may be overdetermined by a relational, by a relation that they're in to something else. So there's all or they may have all. Or they may have none, except they're just, so there's all kinds of ways to wrestle with things that already are. That's what he's interested in.
One of the great representations of this in the history of painting is Raphael's School of Athens, where Plato has his finger in the air walking with his student Aristotle, who has his arm that's down here on the ground. It's material.
That's a
We
great
begin with form
representation
here
of the difference
on the
between
ground rather than the transcendental
the air
forms up
versus the
here.
ground.
And really, it's a very good image of what's kind of happening here in terms
Well,
of.
would representation be substance? No.
It's not one of his categories.
It's not what,
So.
I mean, but
Well, this is what the phenomenology, this is a very.
it's a long conversation. But let me
it's a
just
very
finish
long
this kind of
conversation,
introductory.
Because the phenomenologists want to take on the category of substance,
Yeah.
doesn't really exist ultimately.
Yeah.
You see this in Sartre, you see this in Husserl, you even see it somewhat in Hegel, in terms of.
But I just want to go back to
Yeah, no, I
kind
don't
of the
want to
basic
get away.
kind of fundamental thing, because for me, it's very important. This kind of how he gets into this categories, predication, subjects,
Right.
and then he kind of builds from there. All right, so we said that he's focused more on the ontological reading of that sentence, because he's interested in uncovering as accurately as possible, as truthfully as possible, the relationship between beings. So, predication is an ontological matter for Aristotle. So, for example, if we go back to that sentence that he loves, Socrates is a human being or Socrates walks. So if we go to Socrates walks, what does that mean? Something is said of another thing, and they both exist. That's what predication is. So now the question is, what does it mean to predicate? To predicate on the most direct level means to say something about something else. but both from the vantage point of something that exists. Right? So when we say Socrates walked, we say that we're predicating one thing, walking, of another thing, which is Socrates. And this is kind of an introduction to chapter 2, to book 2, where he makes these fourfold distinctions of something that is said of versus something that is in something. Right? So this is how he's going to get into these 4 possible ways of existing. In some ways, this is his most audacious and arrogant, in a good sense, as Spinoza's opening line in the Ethics, where he defines God. Can you imagine the kind of self-confidence you have to have in 17th century Europe, Christian society, as a Jew, that says, what is God? On the first sentence, it's unlimited, endless energy that permeates everything.
After being kicked out of the synagogue.
No. As soon as they heard that, they're like, get out.
Yeah, but I wrote that after that synagogue.
But that's also the definition of matter
24.
in modern physics, for example, as a side. So Aristotle's going to... Okay, so predication. What
Mainly because he said the Jews weren't the chosen people. That's why
he said
really
that too.
Kicked out.
And then, get out. So,
Bye. How dare you talk about the state of Israel so early in the...
Are those power cubes?
So just to say a little bit more in the time remaining about predication then. So, because I always have trouble with this set of, and so on and so forth, but in some ways he's basically saying Socrates walks to, when we predicate, we're basically saying one thing of another. Okay? So we're saying that walking is Socrates. You can almost invert it when we say Socrates walking, right? So we're predicating walk. We're saying that Socrates is walking. So this is sort of what the technical term, what predication means on an initial level. Another way to think about predication, depending on the example that we use. For example, if I say Arto is entering the subway, now there's a location element that's introduced. A notion of place is introduced here, much more specifically. Because if you say Socrates is walking, he could be walking in New York. He could be walking underwater, on the seafloor. He could be walking in Queens. But when I say I'm entering the subway station at 14th Street, I'm also predicating, but now it's a different kind of a predication in terms of its meaning, ontological meaning. I'm in a different specific context. I am now in a specific place called the subway station at 14th Street, right? The maneuver is the same on the level of logic. And the maneuver is the same. I'm still saying something about something else. It's just that what I'm saying about Arto is now delimited by place rather than some other more general notion of place. So this is a more specific. So in other words, you can see how he can get into all kinds of gradations depending on the circumstances of what he is describing or what we're encountering.
Whitey's on the moon.
What's that?
Whitey's on the moon. Gil Scott Heron.
Who also did, what was the famous one? The revolution will not be televised.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so I just want to sort of follow my notes here a little bit because I want to say this in a deliberate way. So, horse is an animal. Horse is an animal, just to practice. We're predicating something of something else. We're predicating animal of horse. Right? So, it's the same maneuver here. We're saying something about something else. Now, what is happening here? Very simply, but this is very important, what are shown and exposed are relationships between two things that exist. Okay? Now, just to give you a very short sort of time capsule movement, just to say, so it doesn't appear that he's dealing with trivialities. Later on, when Marx is studying the movements of capital in the world economy, and he's trying to describe the movement, right? And he arrives at a particular relationship which is also a movement. It's not a predication necessarily in this way. Aristotle's discussion of predicates will transition into the syllogism, which is a little bit more expanded and complicated, which this is a version of. So when Marx says, in this most simplified formula, capital is exchanged for
Money, not capital, money.
Money thinks you're
not money. Never money.
cash.
Money used as capital. Because money is different things. We have to qualify what money is. Is it a store of value?
Yeah, but if you use M, it's gonna be money in the Marxist equation, he always uses M. He'll use C for capital.
Money,
Or commodity.
money as capital.
Yeah.
Money
Okay.
as capital.
So the transformation is already taken.
Money
place.
is capital.
Money
You're
into
deploying value, you're deploying stored wealth with the intention of increasing the value of that wealth. That's what capital is, on a
Right.
certain fundamental sense. Whether it's money or real estate, it doesn't matter. But the point is, this is capital because you could start with real estate here and not money. Your starting point of investment of the capital accumulation
No,
cycle.
it has to be
Not
transferred.
especially.
What's that?
It has to be moved
Moved.
into the position
Moved
of
into
capital.
the
It's
position.
very
Okay, you want to
important.
stay with that type of capital, like finance capital.
No, all capital.
All capital has to be.
Like
transferred,
the
yeah.
object of, or it could be rubies.
Right.
But there is a transformation.
Rubies
There's a
in your, under
transformation.
your bed
Yeah.
don't do anything.
I'm lending my.
Unless
I'm,
they're transformed.
I'm
Unless
renting-
they're moved
Yeah.
into an investment
So
possibility,
diamonds.
it's called
I'm-
in terms.
These-
I'm renting my house
Right.
as a commodity. I'm
Correct.
converting it. I'm transforming it into a commodity. It's no
Correct.
longer my house, intended for my life, intended for my living in it. I've transformed it into a commodity.
You've commodified it.
Yes.
Come on.
And by doing that, I've created the conditions for the next stage in this relationship.
Correct.
So this doesn't have to be money per se. This could be anything that's used and can be transformed into something that has a price in order to access it in such a way, from my point of view as the capitalist, that allows me to increase the amount at the end. It could be anything.
But
This could be an
that all
idea.
presupposes the previous sphere of CMC, you know, because you ended up with the house or the apartment that you're.
No.
you're
CMC denotes not the circulation of capital, but the functioning of the working class in a capitalist society where you can only exchange your labor, which is a commodity already, for money, and then you end with the same commodity that then you have to spend in order to buy all the necessities for life. There is no capital here at all. This is a very important
No, this
distinction.
is a conversion of
Yes.
money. The first circuit is a conversion back to
sorry,
commodity, to buy more commodities.
I'm trying to understand
First circuit.
the
Yeah.
debate here.
Yeah, yeah.
Forget it. All I wanted to say,
But I think that I'm not very well read in the Marxist canon,
Right,
but
right.
from my limited
Right.
knowledge, may I suggest that money is basically a sort of a reified form of the relationship, or of the sort of dynamic of the whole economy, so to speak. So it's a sort of sacralization and also fetishization of the whole.
this is why
process.
I agree. I don't want to
So
use
money-
money.
So
when
money
we
is,
talk about
is
capital per se.
tangible. Money is tangible. It's full of meaning. It has sort of an aura. It's full of theological niceties. whereas capital is a category.
Yes. That's what I was trying to go. I was trying to make the analogy that far away from Aristotle, Marx and Adam and Ricardo, the great British economist, political economist before him, and this is an example of categorical thinking, if you will, used to create relations between beings that have meaning for people, that are explicit, whether you're a capitalist or a worker. That's all I'm saying. Please don't associate capital with money primarily. That's not true. That's not true.
Well, that's not the association going on, it's the relation of how money is converted into capital. Capital can be the equipment that you have at the Google headquarters in terms of electronic stuff
Yes.
that is depreciated and amortized over many,
No,
many
absolutely
years.
true.
All these things.
But money can
So-
also function from the working class, as simply a means for buying commodities, as a means of exchange, right?
But that's not
That's right, and that's not
functions in
capital.
the capitalist system as a category relationally to capital.
Right,
It's
but in
not
other words,
capital as such.
yes, money
Right.
can and does function as capital,
Right.
absolutely true. But there are other things that function as capital too, which are denominated by money or measured by money.
No, money doesn't itself function as capital.
No.
In volume 2, he's very clear about the distinction.
Right.
He makes
Yes.
a very strong emphasis on
Yes.
the distinction.
Yes,
Money itself is just, it could be under your mattress. It doesn't do anything itself.
But how does it function from the point of view of the capitalist?
Well, they have to convert it into an investment, as we would call it in contemporary
So
times.
money is a form of capital from the point of view
When
of the
converted.
capitalist. Yes.
Yes.
When it's converted.
But
Yes.
That's the transformation problem.
It is when it's converted, it becomes capital, but from the sort of position of the capitalist, money is already capital.
That's what I'm saying.
Has its
In other words,
Ideally.
This is
And they're
so one of the
fantasy.
interesting things that I think is a
I'm
little bit more,
almost
for me, was always complicated but
Well, it's a
subtle,
part of
is
capital.
that when Marx is
Part
studying
of.
when Marx is studying capital flows of different types, whether it's merchant capital or finance capital or industrial capital, one of the points that I think he's making between the lines is that your actual being, if you're a capitalist, from the vantage point of a capitalist, money functions or is something something different than from the vantage point of the working class, right? So in other words, your position in the relation as it functions is different from the position also of the scientist studying capitalism. Okay? So that's another level of complexity in Marx's argument that's kind of implied. That when he studies capital, the circulation and accumulation of capital, whether it's rarefied relations, in this case, that's all true from the point of view of the theorist thinking about something that already has happened, already exists in society. That vantage point is different from the point of view of the people owning, Apple Incorporated. And our analysis have to be able to account all different levels of meaning assigned to the circulation of capital from the point of view of the capitalist, from the point of view of the scientist studying capital flows, from the point of view of the worker who is the C in the MCC plus M plus, right? So this is what he's trying to do. So in other words, he's saying that the answer appears different depending on our placement in the process. This is just another way of saying that he's a materialist. But in other words, the vantage point of me studying capital, as David Harvey or as another famous student of capital, is qualitatively different from the way capital is thought about by people who actually do invest capital.
Yes and no.
Wait a minute.
Yes and no. Yeah.
Yes,
yeah,
the
yeah,
problem is that the worker has to create a professional labor position which requires investment, one way or the other, in schooling,
Right.
etc. So they have to commodify their labor on the market to survive. Unless there's of course multiple different positions. That's why if you look at Grey Gardens' film, for example, there are two women in there, as far as I know, that are living off of inherited money, and there's very little left. You see this particular portrait. They are not capitalists in a strictly technical sense. If anything, they might be lumped in proletariat. I don't know how we would define it exactly, but they're not workers.
I
They're
think
not.
it's more of an immanent position. It has less to do with the empirical.
My only point is that they're not converting their cash into capital. They are not technically speaking capitalists themselves.
Yeah.
These two ladies
Yeah.
in that film. Just
But-
by way as an example.
Yeah, but I'm trying to think how Aristotle would have said that if he was around in that sense. He might have said something
Well, I
like
mean-
the beingness of that person and the various things that are associated with that person who sits on $5 million, but they haven't converted that into capital. Is that going to be qualitatively different from somebody who's actively? Yes, it will be, because different relations will pop up when you convert your stored wealth that's sitting in a safe, or when you sell your violin on the market, and for $5 million, and you convert that into investment that starts a particular business that employs, that buys the labor time of workers. Yes, so there will be differences. Okay, yeah. But let's leave Marx aside for a little bit, because I shouldn't.
But you raise the question, though, of how do you determine, vis-a-vis Aristotle, new categories for understanding? Yes. This is really where we're going.
So Aristotle is saying...
what do you have as a new category? We've talked about this in the past. You're at a stage of capital now where you have a new circuit, which includes derivatives. There's $750 trillion of derivatives floating out there that might not be productive capital, but it is floating out that backs certain things, that intervenes in certain
So if we
how do we develop a category to deal with
first
this
we
in
ask,
terms of the new relation?
From
an Aristotelian
are
point
Aristotle's
of view? Or is that adequate enough for our purposes?
Are Aristotle's 10 existing categories, can they capture the substance or something that's essentially true about derivatives. So you can say yes to temporal dimension. So derivatives have a place and a time, right? They have a certain quality. They have a certain quantity. So we can definitely use Aristotle's categories to make sense of derivatives if we wanted to. And we can certainly fit it into the fourfold division of being by asking the question, are derivatives set of? Is there some being that is set of in a derivative? Or in a derivative? Or not in a derivative? And you know what I mean? You can go through these permutations, and he's claiming if you do that, you will acquire certain insight about the being of derivatives that is helpful, because it'll be closer to the true sort of beingness of that thing, because you'll be able to capture its different dimensions of existence. Its temporal dimension, its quantitative, qualitative. You'll capture the relations that it's in. You just have to put it in a sentence, because that's how we make sense of the world. You have to write about it. You have to talk about it with subject-predicate relations. And then if you do that carefully and you pay attention, you will be able to understand something insightful about derivatives, rather than just saying derivatives are something that traded in the market and, something more general like that. That is not very...
The predication of the derivative market right now is it has no substance. That's the predication.
But it does. It exists in databases as electrons.
Goes negative, it's over.
Yeah.
But as long as we have electricity and the servers are running in the investment banks, derivatives are beings. They are a thing. They have a shape, if you will. It's digital. They're of a quantity, so they have borders. They're delimited.
They have a history.
They have a history. They have relations. They're in relation to other things, to other types of financial instruments. So even though the medium is digital and not analog, Aristotle...
Okay, so
yeah.
that's where I was brought up about do thing, just to get to the point of, okay, is a magic trick a substance? Is an illusion a substance? Is another way of putting it.
I mean, a magic trick, you made the magician appear to be flying or suspended in midair. I'm seeing that. That's substance. I'm seeing it. I'm materially experiencing as something that is happening in front of my eyes. Now, I may not know. He may be cheating in the sense that he may be suspended with very thin wires, but that has a particular beingness which makes it susceptible to analysis by the categories of Aristotle. We have successfully breached the introduction to book one of the categories of Aristotle.
Are we ready to ask the question?
We'll do the best we can. I mean, in terms of time, because
How do I find this on YouTube?
it's very interesting. So, are there any questions, or do you want to do like 5 more minutes, or do you want to call it a day?
If you
Or
want to watch the thing,
What do we read for next week?
well, my goal was this was going to be books 1 through 5, and then next week 6 through 10. But I think the books that we're going to focus on the most are 2. 1 will be sort of a quick. 2 is very important. 5. So 2, 5 are probably the central sections, although obviously 3 and 4 will have something to say. But 2 and 5 are going to be our focus, and then
if you go to that on the website, it has all the
6
stuff up you can watch on YouTube.
I couldn't hear you.
6 is very important because 6 describes quantity. What is quantity?
But the answer is, what are you going to focus on next week?
2, 5.
2, 5.
And then hopefully 6 as well. And then
Last week you emphasized 10.
and then we're gonna go through 7, 8,
2 ways you can find
and then we're gonna emphasize 10 as well. whenever
By
we
the
get
way,
to it.
the model that's used by the scholars
This is the
is
Striker.
based on 15
I think it's Cambridge. On our website, there's a link to a,
On the homepage.
to
Fine,
a,
I've never
to a, I mean, for educational
That will be my.
for illustrative
Make sure you
purposes, we have
subscribe.
linked,
I
so you can
vote I
see it and then
should
you
learn
can
about
get
that.
You
it.
should,
you know,
yeah.
Okay,
Useful.
alright.
So
Whichever way
So-
for, you know,
What's the name of the organization that you're with in Bulgaria?
it's the Institute for the Critical Studies of Supermodern Capitalism. ICTS.org.
Institute for the Study of
None of-
Supermodern.
Yes, none of their works are translated to English yet, but they're engaged in some of the most profound
Yeah, sure.
um,
I think,
rereadings of dialectical logic, Aristotle, Hegel, Marx,
thank you.
moving beyond, reading Schumpeter, all kinds of Heidegger, Derrida. One of the things they've done, for example, is argue that Marx's formulas representing capital, they've expanded them with minus z variable, which relates to the notion of loss of capital and destruction of capital and sort of how that's accounted for. So they have an English site section, icts.org, where you can read their manifesto and some of their theoretical things. Extraordinarily interesting.
What does supermodern mean?
This is their way of saying that we don't live in a postmodern world, but we live in a hyper-modern world where there's an intensification of all the features of, hyper-positivist world, hyper-formalization in that positive sense, hyper-industrialization rather than de-industrialization.
Okay. Is that somehow related to the late Baudrillard?
Which one?
The late Baudrillard, who wrote about hyper reality.
It's not in that sense,
Okay.
but
okay.
yeah.
Okay.
But yeah. I hope they make their works available in English, but that's always the problem if you write or think in a language that's not English, because everybody reads English, but not everybody reads Bulgarian.